Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, Circle of Hope. My name is Valerie Hope. I am your host. I am so grateful that we have this forum to bring together people in my own circle and we explore how connections help us grow and thrive. Today, I have a wonderful guest, one that I have been acquainted with, have the fortune of being acquainted with for many years, Ingrid Gavshon. Ingrid, you and I go back, oh my gosh, 7, 8 years potentially, something like that. I think we met in 2017 for the first time because you were one of the faculty at the Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute, and I had the opportunity to get my coaching certification through the institute back in 2017. And I don't even think, to be honest, and you'll have to remind me of this. Uh, First of all, I don't think we connected then at the actual institute. There were several faculty members. Reba was my faculty coach, and then there were other people that were involved. But I don't even think you and I had a particularly profound conversation. Do you remember this?
I don't remember if we had a conversation, but I do remember that somewhere along the line, you and I connected and we found we had a lot in common.
Yes. What was that? Do you remember?
I don't, but I remember thinking that there was a soul connection there.
It was a soul connection. I think it's coming back to me. So first of all, I want to say thank you for saying yes to being a guest on the podcast. This is your third podcast with me. You have been on all three of my podcasts, and so I'm just so grateful that you've been a yes each time. And we've always had lovely conversations because of whatever that soul connection was that you just mentioned. I think it happened because I started working as a faculty coach also and with the Haas Business School, right? And when you all brought me in and other coaches to support the EMBA classes, the evening weekend MBA courses, that's where I think you and I had a lot more time. And we were there for several days on end, and you and Mark would take us out to dinner afterwards and stuff like that. And I think that's where we first started to get to know each other even better. But those of you listening, tuning in here, I think a few things you should know about Ingrid that I've come to appreciate so much is not only are we, coaches and we have that in common, but my first podcast, I remember I don't even remember how it came about that we had a conversation about your background because you are a documentary filmmaker. And I learned about this several years ago. And I remember my first podcast as I was coming to the end of 100 episodes and I was closing out the podcast. I said, I would like to now be in the guest seat and have somebody interview me. And the one person that came to mind that I thought, who would really do a good interview and like get into some of the things that I don't know that I even think of, it's Ingrid. So I was like, Ingrid, you have to interview me for my podcast. So you were both you were in the guest seat and the host seat for that podcast. What was that like? Do you remember?
It's always just such a pleasure working with you. You've got such an interesting background, your music background, the fact you traveled the world as a 17, 18-year-old with this group of musicians
Yeah, with
singing and
people.
playing music and creating music in the most unbelievable places in South America and Latin America and Europe, going to places that a lot of people would never even think of traveling to today. And
Mhm.
that's really impressed me. And I feel like I'm a global citizen and a world traveler and not necessarily intrepid, but you were far more intrepid than I was.
We have our own ways of being intrepid. But I will say that I remember one of the reasons that I thought you would be great to ask me those questions is because your way of of being intrepid has a lot more to do with the human psyche. You have been on the other end of the camera in front of very controversial figures in your country in South Africa, right? You have had opportunities to like hold space for people who are dealing with very tragic, difficult circumstances, and you can, in the face of all that, still hold space in a graceful, compassionate way. You're curious, right? There's so many things about you that, I mean, the idea of courage in the face of humanity, I think you embody that so wonderfully. And so I think that's really what connects us, that part of that curiosity and compassion that we have for people. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think that we both see people for who they are rather than for what they represent,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it's their opinions or whether their ideas or their religion. We see people as humans, and I think that's what drew me to you.
Mm. Have we always had that? Have you always noticed that that was a way in which you connected with others? Or when was the first time that you realized that connection with people and seeing humans that way
I don't
mattered?
think I ever, it's a great question. I don't think I remember when I could connect. However, growing up in South Africa, a very contested space, my parents were always tried to make us really aware of what other people were facing and
Yeah.
what they were up against. And I think that when I lived in England, I worked for criminal lawyers. And that's where I really honed my skill of asking questions without blame or judgment
Mm.
as we teach. And I feel that I was working with people, very, very different backgrounds from mine, going to prisons. I work for criminal lawyers, and going to prisons and sitting and asking people about their lives.
Yeah.
And I was really curious about who they were, what was their background, how did they get to be sitting at some table, often a laminate table in a really dank room where their lives were in balance. And if I asked them the wrong question, they would incriminate themselves and we couldn't represent them.
Mm.
And if I asked, I think a lot of people had never, no one had ever asked them questions about who they were or their backgrounds or why they'd got to be where they were. And I felt it was my duty as the
Mm.
person representing them to actually find out more about them, find maybe was there some key or clue that would
Yeah.
help them when they got to court.
I think that's what an interesting skill to develop, right? Especially when the stakes are so high, right? When you're talking about someone, whether or not that person goes to prison for whatever length of time, which is such a traumatic thing in, I imagine, the lives of not only that individual, but their family, maybe their community, right? And depending on the circumstances behind those cases. When you think about taking the time and making the effort to talk to people and understand them and being very mindful about the questions that you're crafting, it's one thing to ask the proper questions. I'm curious about, what do you do when you're listening? How do you listen in a way that gives you, one, the information that you're seeking, that you need, but also gives you that additional understanding, or that brings that humanity in what they're in your experience with them? What do you listen for?
It's listening for what's not being said.
Hmm.
It's listening for possibility. If you really know somebody else, you'll probably find some level of commonality, whether it's an interest in books or music or life experiences. Maybe there's none whatsoever. You think that there's actually no point of connection. When one stops and doesn't think, "Oh, what's my next question? I have to be sort of clever, or I have to jump into this conversation and contribute." And you're actually just listening and then see people's body language or
Mhm.
see that you've touched something in that person and then
Yeah.
ask permission to explore a bit further. I think that's
Yeah.
when one finds really finds people.
Yeah. Hmm.
And as I said, I don't think people very often get asked questions. That's why I think your podcast is so interesting, because you're delving and asking people questions about themselves that they haven't actually stopped to think about. For me, it
Yeah.
was just a great job. I was a photographer at the time. A friend of mine was working as what was called an outdoor clerk, which in America would be a paralegal for this
Hmm.
law firm. I was in number 32 on the list. And within about 3 or 4 months, I was number 2 on the list of people that invited because I would go anywhere at any time because this was like, you know, London in the 80s, fascinating, completely different from my upbringing in South Africa. And I got to see a side of England that I didn't, or the UK that I would not normally have experienced
Yeah.
without this amazing 5 years where I got a window into other people's lives. And that made
Hmm.
me more curious to know more.
Because of your uh, international status, right? Your global citizenry as a South African with British descent who's lived in different parts of the world and now living in California, right? I'm curious about how does your communication change from one culture to another? I mean, you're talking to individuals, whether you were doing these documentaries or working in this law firm or working in the media and even now as a coach, right? You have all these different audiences, people that your clients that you're connecting with. What did you notice about the way in which you communicated with different cultures?
I have to admit, first of all, I just have to say, I'm not of British descent. I was very lucky to go and study and work in England, and that's how
Mm,
I became an English citizen, but or British citizen. But I actually was just an English-speaking South African. I was
okay.
born and bred in South Africa. When I go to different places. I try and go and read before I go. And this is even before the internet. I was going to Norway to do some filming in Norway. So I got a book about culture in Norway. And I
Hmm,
read it from cover to cover before I got on the plane. So I could understand the kind of cultural norms. And each country's got different cultural norms. And now it's so much easier. You get on the internet or you ask Perplexity or ChatGPT or
yeah.
your bot of choice, and they will tell you exactly about the cultures. But sometimes one has to read the culture, and sometimes you're in a multicultural audience, and you'll have people from Asia or India or Africa or from South America, North America, in the same room, and it's how do you reach all those people?
Hmm,
And it's about not giving up your own personality, but also trying to see how your message lands.
yeah.
Because if you come from a culture like America, which is much more individualistic, where people are much more outspoken, and then you go to Asia, and if you
Mhm.
try and reach people with that are more from a communal society,
Yeah.
you will find people might look a little askance.
Hmm.
However, if you go in and you're interested in the people and you start watching how they all act and interact with one another, you pick up pretty quickly from people's body language and the way they address each other.
Yeah. It's interesting because I remember, you alluded to Up With People earlier in the conversation. So for people who don't know, it was an international leadership program for young adults, and we traveled all over the world. We performed a musical, we lived with host families, did community service in all these different communities all over the world. So I lived out of a suitcase for 5 years, right out of college. That was my first job, and I worked as an event coordinator, and then I moved into recruiting, and then I moved into cast operations. And so I remember in one of our training sessions, because the other thing, the group itself was very diverse. So we would have casts of 100 to 130 people, generally representing about 20 to 30 different countries, right? People would come from all over the world for this. And we do this activity in one particular cast. I remember we do this educational activity where every group within the cast or every subgroup in the cast would have to do some sort of poster to represent their culture. And so we had, the Swiss, and then the Austrians, and the Japanese, and some subgroups. Like there was an LGBTQ group, there's an African American group, there's right. So there was all these subgroups too. People could decide whatever group they felt they had the most resonance and be a part of that group. Then each group had to go in front of the cast and share that particular poster and talk about how they represented themselves or depicted the culture. And I remember the American group, which was the largest, we had usually the largest cast. The cast usually were the biggest group was represented by the Americans, people from the US and Canada, a lot of North Americans in the group. So it was a pretty big number. And they had this big poster, and I say they because I think I went to the Latin American group, which is the smallest. And being from Panama, I felt like I needed to add a little bit of let me add some content there. So the American group got up, and the poster was red, white, and blue, stars and stripes. It was, just very decorative, and there was so much excitement. Everybody was, there are a lot of extroverted energy, a lot of people speaking up. And because it was such a large group, the energy was quite big. And then there was a question from one of the German participants who said, "Why do you all have to have a flag everywhere? Like red, white, and blue all over the place. What's with that?" And it was like a match was lit in that moment. Somebody struck a match, and there was the defensive and justifying of the why and why not started to come up. And a lot of it had to do with, there's pride in the flag and what it stands for, and there's the anthem and the pledge, and all these things came up. And then the question was tossed back to their German group. Well, why come you guys don't do you don't have your flag all over the place? And they said, they started to talk about what the flag represented and the nationalism that it was known for, and the danger and of the connection to the history of Nazi Germany, and how they had, this generation had been taught that there's no pride in these particular symbols of nationhood, or the danger that could come from it. It was a beautiful conversation. Once we got to that part, everybody was puffed up and just ready to rumble. But then we started to understand, oh, okay. And then, we were like, the Canadians always have their flag on everything. What's going, how come you don't ask the Canadians? And the Canadians were like, we just want to show that we're not American. Anyway, it was fascinating, just that moment in time. So, coming back to what you were saying earlier, I think starting to see and hear how other people perceive what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, what things mean, like the meaning that we ascribe to different things, and trying to understand the meaning rather than reacting to what people are doing or not doing was so important. So anyway, I want to pause and see your reaction or thought about that anecdote.
I'm very curious about how in those situations do you diffuse when people are like getting very defensive? What is it that
Yeah.
you do?
So in that particular moment, that was our education staff was responsible for that, facilitating that exercise. So I don't recall in that moment being actively involved in the diffusion part. But I think for me now, and what I've done in other situations that are similar to that, I'm usually the person that will rephrase what the group is saying. Like, I think the question is coming from a curiosity, you know, in the US, flags are used. So I would probably rephrase so that it maybe take some of the edge off. And then also have to rephrase whatever the response is, just to recreate the meaning behind the words and to ask for clarification. Usually that's a way, what I've learned anyways, is that when people speak, we often have a lot of subtext in the words that we use that other people don't pick up on, or they do and they put their own we tend to put our meaning to things, and the way we said something is supposed to mean something to someone else, but it's often misunderstood. And so I find that recreating somebody is just by saying, so what I'm hearing is XYZ. And if I can get the intent of the question and name it, or emotion that's coming, that's underneath all of it, and name it, generally people feel more heard, and the defensiveness starts to kind of fade away. And then we start thinking about the content rather than and the content and the context more deeply. That's what I would do.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with you. It's about how do you make people feel seen
Yeah.
and heard and acknowledged, as Mark
Yes.
Rittenberg, our teacher, says. And how do you acknowledge that there are differences, that people might have cultural differences, that things might be very different. You know, I was thinking when I went to India to work on my first documentary film, I also read a book on culture in India. That was a whole series that I found in my local bookshop. But I learned that everyone walks in and the first thing you say is namaste. And if you're doing business, you hand over your business card. Now, I was just the researcher on this and associate producer on this film. But I was with the director who had been making films for about 30 years. And people, because I walked in and I had a business card and handed it over, they would refer to me rather than referring to this man who was a lot older than me and a lot
Oh
more
boy.
experienced than me. And eventually, after about a week, I said, I think we'd better get you some business cards made. And I ran around Delhi getting the man some business cards, and it balanced
Yeah.
it balanced things out.
Status.
But I think that it's about seeing people and seeing, yes, I have pride in my American flag. I personally don't have pride in I don't take pride in any of these symbols, just having grown up in South Africa. But I think that, you know, whoever did it in your group, acknowledging, okay, yes, well, this is Americans feel very strongly about their flag and will stand by it. And as you say, your German person felt like, no, we don't subscribe to symbols because of our history. And I think that's a really interesting learning moment. And it's like, what can one take in these kind of conversations when you're having a group conversation rather than keeping it on the surface? These moments give you the opportunity to really dive deeper.
Yes.
And say and to explore these cultural differences. I think you worked, I believe you worked on one of the projects that I was running for a group in Asia, and we had people from different Asian countries. And a lot of these Asian countries had been at war with one another at some stage.
I wasn't part of the project, but I'd heard some things about it.
And people, you know, we had a lot of discussions beforehand about how should we deal with this? When we're pairing people together, when we're pairing coaches, we have to be cognizant of the political history. And I think that's really politics and the history. And I think that's really something important. And even in the workplace, it's really, I've worked with people from very different cultures. And there's been this rub. And how do you know, it's about encouraging the client to say, what is it that you can find this commonality? And then when people start speaking, I mean, one of my very, very early coaching clients was at a big tech company. And these two women came to me and said, well, we need help because we're often on two calls at the same time, 2 or 3 calls at the same time. And we don't have an opportunity to speak. And we're also women in tech, and it's really difficult. So this is like 15 years ago. And there were fewer women in this company then. So eventually I tried to help them. And I said, well, what about actually getting to know the people? Because they were all remote. The teams that they were in charge of were remote. What about getting in touch with and asking each person in the team to present something about themselves or their lives or their cultures each week? And if there's a big holiday like Diwali or Eid that you celebrate in some way, and it was remarkable. Within about 6 weeks, both people were reporting back, wow, I've reorganized my schedule that I only have one meeting at a time. And then we start the first 5 minutes is just actually getting to know the people in the team. And we found a lot of the friction between people is actually being ameliorated because people actually hearing and seeing that, oh, there's a lot of commonality in belief.
Mm. I love that you shared that. So I think the thought that's been in my mind since we started talking about this idea of this global kind of community that we connect to is like, how do we get the culture, like a cultural translation, right, that enable us. So you go for the knowledge, right? So you go for a book to help you at least get, a bit of a leg up. I don't do that at all. And I think it's my one, as an immigrant, maybe part of it is I do feel that I can walk into spaces and get to know my dad was in the military, so we moved around quite a bit, even once we came to the US. And so I've always had to be in positions where I'm like, I have to study the culture from the inside. Right. And then up with people, same thing. They would drop us into a host family. We had no clue who we were staying with. We literally met them the night that they were taking us home. The most we had was like, is it a nice car? Like, we're young. So we're like, we'll stay in a cool house. But, I've stayed in with host families that lived in mansions. I've stayed in host families who had me in a trailer in the backyard because that's, they, or like everything in between. We've stayed in a homeless shelter. I remember staying in a homeless shelter in Ohio. We stayed in an orphanage in Portugal. So we've had all these different living experiences, and I had no idea before going in. And although we knew that we were going to be touring Germany or Denmark or Venezuela, I didn't always do the study up front. But I trust so much my ability to connect with people that I will get the information I need on the ground, like boots on the ground. Um, and but I do respect and I can appreciate how important it is, especially for the type of work you were doing. When you're filming something, you have to know, you get a depth of knowledge before you go so that you're able to navigate the conversations that you need to have and get the results that you want. I often went with the outcome of just getting to know people. I didn't have a result that I was hoping to produce. So I want to kind of move in this direction now in this conversation because when I first talked to you about this podcast, one of the things that came up for us was the idea of, we live in a world right now there's so many things that are on fire about this world. How different cultures are just not connecting eye to eye. There's so much controversy in some of that, and without getting particular about the politics and the cultures that are at war, I do want to talk about how do you go beyond what's just on the news and what you have read or heard from other people? How do you get beyond that to really connect? I mean, you've done this as a documentary filmmaker. How do you get beyond what's out in the popular media to understand what you need to produce? And maybe you can tell us a story or an example that depicts that.
I think it's about you put two people in a room, even if they're from opposite sides in a war, and give them some questions or make them curious about the other.
Mm,
And you will find some commonality. So I remember when we were chatting, I told you I did a film about this right-wing organization in South Africa. And I was very, very anxious. I drove with my film crew. I took a white film crew, although I usually worked with an African man who I absolutely adore, Musa, on all my films. But I was very careful about the crew I chose. And then we went to this very small town run by this organization. And I had heard this man had these beautiful stallions. And I'd actually been at one of their demonstrations where they brought these stallions into this hall in Pretoria, and they lit the flag, they set the flag on fire, and the horses all reared, and it was very dramatic. And this was a few years later. I had to go and interview him for a film that I was doing for Dutch television. And we drove into the town and we kept talking to each other, trying to bolster each other. And I also knew that being somebody living in a rural area, he must have dogs. So we got there and he has these like big Rottweilers, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm really scared of dogs, especially big dogs. And I said, oh, I've heard that you have these dogs, and there's lying at his feet and stuff like that. And what are their names? And trying to find some element of commonality, something to make a connection, to make it slightly better, to make it easier. And then to be able to have a conversation, because what I learned as a filmmaker, sometimes I worked with people from various broadcasters, and they'd come in, they'd sit down and they'd start asking their questions. They'd have 5 questions and they'd ask the 5 questions, and that would be it, and they'd leave. But my tack, because I was sort of self-taught and I hadn't gone to film school and learned this is what you do, I would go in and I would, first of all, read up as much as I could about the subject so that I felt more in control. It was much for me, not so much about the subject. It was for me to feel, okay, I have some background knowledge. I'd come with my questions and I'd sit there with my little white pad. And as people were speaking, I would look and I'd make notes, things to come back to, because if there was a tributary, I'd follow the tributary. But I would start off asking just broader questions. Often when they do a sound check, they say, well, tell me what you had for breakfast. And then people say, I had coffee and a bagel or donut or whatever it might be. But something that was to get sound levels.
Yeah.
But for me, I would just sit down and ask them more general questions, things that I'd read about them or that I knew or thought would be safe topics, that they could talk about, that would make people sort of feel they could sit down. And then I would start talking about the harder issues, because a lot of the films that I worked on, some of them were investigative films, and there you were trying to actually get someone to acknowledge what they
were trying to hide,
or what they had, not wanted. There'd been a big massacre of 32 people in this township outside of Johannesburg. And everybody knew it was this Inkatha Freedom Party that had done it. And I got to interview the head of the party, of the organization, about 2 or 3 days later. And he was ducking and diving and talking up a storm and giving sort of 5-minute answers, and you never interrupted. And I did sort of put my hand up to try and interrupt. And at the end, one of the film crew said to me, you really did try and get him to acknowledge that they had been responsible for this. You asked the question 8 different ways. I thought that was very good tracking. But it was, and then when I was making films about people, it was more about, it's not about trying to get people to acknowledge things about themselves, but it was, if it was a film about HIV, or a film about healthcare, or a film about something really painful in people's lives, I would ask really wide questions first and then keep narrowing down, so that as the trust builds.
Yeah.
And I try and make people feel that it was just that person and me. I'd be sitting next to the camera lens would be almost next to my ear. The film crew would be behind the camera, and no one else in the room. And I try and build this connection by making eye contact. Really important. Even on Zoom, it's about making eye contact. I don't know if I'm making eye contact with you right now, but I should be looking at green dot. But
yeah,
it's about making eye contact. It's about sort of using body language to acknowledge, to shake your head, sort of not in a forced way, but whatever comes naturally, to show that you are being empathetic to what the person is actually telling you about. And
Yeah.
people will then be more prepared to open up to you.
Yes.
Also, in terms of filmmaking, I try and interview my subjects beforehand, off
Hmm.
camera, either on the phone or in person if I could, even if it's just even before that, we set up the cameras so that people got some sense. And then I tell them about myself. I'd share a
Right.
little bit about myself. In coaching, I don't really do that much. I don't share that much about myself. I just give a brief introduction of who I am, so you can ask me anything, sacred cows. Um, but as a filmmaker, I try and find some way of actually creating that bridge.
The bridge, yeah. I think what you're pointing to, it's the word relatedness that comes up in all these examples is that and so much can be done, right? Relatedness is this idea of understanding the other person, of getting to know the other person, is the advice that you encourage that coaching client to follow, right? And asking people questions about themselves. And like you said, it ameliorates so much of the misunderstanding and friction that occurs sometimes when people start to get curious about each other, or when you reveal something. I find that really helpful too. In fact, I remember going to networking events. I can't stand like small talk. I'm just not interested in expending my time and energy on small talk. And as extroverted as I am, I go in, and not that I want to be invasive or impolite with people, but I like to go into something with some meaning. And I remember going to this Chamber of Commerce event here in Texas. And it was like a breakfast. So, early in the morning, and people are just trying to get their coffee and their bagel or donut or whatever. You're starting off really light, but you're mingling. And, I'm trying to find, I was just starting my business at the time too. And so part of it was for me just to share with people what I was doing. And I remember this gentleman, he was from the UK as well, actually, and had been living in Texas for a long time. And somehow he and I were in a small group of people, and somehow the group started talking about travel. And there was a woman in the group that was sharing some of the trips that she'd taken and some vacation time, etc. And this gentleman made some comment about travel. And after the group just changed subjects, I turned to him and I followed up on what he'd said. And I can't remember exactly the question, but it was just, oh, I heard you mention earlier that this was a trip that what inspired that trip? That's such an interesting place to go. And so he started to share that with me, and I'm like, oh, wow, interesting. I've never done that type of trip before. And when was the first time you knew that you wanted to go there or something like that? I just kind of started pulling very gently on that thread. It turns out that this gentleman shares with me in a breakfast networking event, there was some traumatic childhood experience with his father that came up in our conversation. And he said, yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I found travel so important. He shared a very intimate personal detail. And I listened, and I so thoughtful. He's like, I'm not sure why I'm sharing all this. I don't like talking about this, he tells me. And I said, I understand. You don't have to. I was just really curious about your background. And he said, would you like some more coffee? And I was like, I'm fine. And he's like, all right, I'm gonna get a refill. I mean, it was, it was the of course, I didn't laugh in the moment. I laugh now in reflection because I get that there's something, and I think Ingrid, you probably have this experience too. I've seen it and experienced it from you myself, that there's that moment of connection that's is so solid that you're the only person in the room, it seems like, in that moment, that we're starting to ask questions in a way that shows our interest and our curiosity and our openness, right? No blame, no judgment, like you mentioned, that people say way more than they're usually compelled to share, especially knowing that the environment is kind of a light touch. Um, I'm known in my family for this. My brother calls it, you do the Valerie thing. It's known as a Valerie thing, apparently. People have cried in my presence. He's like, what did you do to them? I'm like, I think people honestly, the relatedness is missing so much in so many of our lives on a regular basis that having a moment like that with another human really moves people to tears sometimes. What do you think about that? What's been your reflection on that?
I think I agree. I think people are losing because of social media,
Mm,
which I definitely use. But I think that people are losing themselves in doom scrolling, in not connecting with other people. And I think COVID had some part in it where people sort of lost the ability to connect. I
mm,
see it a lot with the people that I coach, that sometimes I'm the first person to ask them really deep questions about themselves or follow up questions about something they might have said that's not related necessarily to the work issue that they're being coached on or talking about. And I think it's really sad that have lost this community feeling of, or a town square, whether the town square is getting together and going and having a drink and meeting new people, or going out for meals. People say, oh, I'm too busy, or they rather go and look at whatever, or they'll sit in a restaurant and instead of talking. And it's the same, I talk often to my grandchildren, especially, and I've learned to not say, how was your day?
mm,
I'm now saying, what was the best thing that happened? What was
mm.
the biggest obstacle today? And
Yeah.
I try and have deeper conversations, even although it's on the phone. And I know that they probably got their device nearby and would rather be watching the basketball or baseball, um, or ice hockey. But I try and connect on a different level
Yeah.
rather than just a surface level. And I feel that I don't know how many people today belong to book clubs or community organizations, and not necessarily religious organizations, although they're really good. And I think the people with those connections that maybe go to their church or their mosque or their synagogue every week probably have a stronger sense of community. I think people have lost that sense of community.
Mm,
And it feels like at the moment that people are flailing a little bit. People
mm.
are taking positions.
Yeah.
I'm right and you're wrong, and the twain can't meet.
Yeah.
I was in South Africa last week and somebody started a conversation about one of the wars that are going on at the moment. And the woman's instantly, first of all, brought up the conversation. And it was a quick 10-minute meeting before leaving for the airport. And then started issuing her point of view in a really didactic manner.
Mm,
And I try to say, well, there are other points of view, and maybe, looking at different newspapers, maybe they're all just, and went on off the deep end. I was completely, and I spent most of my journey thinking about how, if I'd had more time, could I have
mm.
reached this person, maybe not to change their mind, and you can't change people's minds,
Yeah.
but maybe to just plant a few seeds that maybe would spark some curiosity or some way of looking
Yeah.
at the other point of view or the other side, and maybe seeing people as humans. It
Mm.
was for me deeply shocking and deeply depressing that this person who had come with another friend, had just come to say goodbye, had
Yeah.
this very deeply held point of view.
Mm.
And I think I don't know, when at BCI, Benjamin Mertz, who's this amazing historian and musician, African American musician, and I did a series called Building Bridges
I
to
remember I was part of that.
I remember. And we try to bring people together from different points of view. And
Mm.
I'd done that in South Africa in the early 90s. I did a series where I brought President Nelson Nelson Mandela together with his prosecutor, Percy Utah.
Mm.
He was the man that had asked for the death penalty, had asked for him and his fellow comrades to basically be killed, to be hanged. And that was one of the people. But then I also brought other people together. And we maybe one of the saddest people we brought together was this man, this father of this man, this young boy. He was like 16 years old, who wanted to be a tailor, and
Mm.
he had a sewing machine. And the police came and took him away because they thought he had a Roneo machine. This is before faxes and printers. People had Roneo machines where you put in 2 pieces of carbon between a piece of paper. My first office job, and you made copies
Like copies?
that way. And he was he was dropped down a mining shaft. It was a mining town, and he was dropped down. He was killed and dropped down. He was interrogated and dropped down a mining shaft, and they never found his body. But we brought him together with the policeman, one of the policemen who'd been in the room. He wasn't the person interrogating him. The policeman was a young constable at the time that had been in the room and had felt very troubled by this all these years later. And there were so many of these unknown stories. But the father thanked us afterwards, and I was absolutely devastated and in tears. Most of hearing his side of the story about his only son. And I feel that if you can find a way of bringing people together and can build these bridges and can find people that maybe have these very strongly held points of view,
Yeah.
and find a way to help them see the humanity in somebody else, even if they'll never agree.
Mm. That's that's such a wow. Those those experiences. I mean, it just the the depth and breadth of human experience that you can have in those conversations in those moments is staggering, really. And even just a small moment in time that has ripple effects not only on the victim and the victim's family, the community, the trust, the break of trust, right, with all these different characters in that particular story. It reminds me, there's a quote from Martin Luther King, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, but what you're saying around people just being able to hear a different point of view. He said something like, we have very little influence over people can feel our underlying contempt, right? So the the idea that there are other points of views, true. The part about whether or not people could be open to hearing them, that's the tricky part. In fact, I remember, I'd like to hear your reaction to this, but I remember having a conversation with my godfather, a human who's been in my life for since I was 15 years old. I adopted him and his wife, actually. They weren't even my godparents from birth, but I adopted him. He and my dad and my dad's family had known each other in Panama when they were kids. They all kind of grew up with the same friend group. We met when I was 15 years old, and he was, outside of my father, the man that taught me so much, had so much wisdom, and I sit at his feet literally, and just eat up all his stories. He gave me so much great advice, mentoring. He still does to this day. He's now 82, and I remember, we also have different political views, and so I was watching some news the other day, and this was a few months ago, and just feeling pretty down about everything. Things were just looking so dark and dismal, and I remember reaching out to him and saying, I'm seeing all of these things and hearing some things in the news. I didn't even specify what I'd seen or what I'd heard, but I said, it doesn't feel good, all the things that I'm hearing and seeing. Do you see any hope? I just need to hear from someone who doesn't see the world the way I see it, if you see something that I'm missing. And we had such a lovely conversation. It was brief and it wasn't about any particular news point or viewpoint. It literally was, hey, you know what? I get what you're saying, Valerie, and this is, I think that there is hope. This is why I think there's hope. Give it some time, have some patience. I know some of this stuff is really difficult for everybody. And we kind of, it was left a bit on the surface, but so let me see if I can express this. The surface was the specific point of view. What was deep was the emotional empathy and the compassion in the conversation. Does that make sense? So without talking about anything specific, I heard he got me. He heard I got him. Like I understood, I felt the empathy. And the reason I went to him is because I knew that I had plenty of people in my circle like me who had similar points of view about the political environment that would just say, yes, oh my gosh, you're right, or feel sorry, or perhaps have some, fuel to add to the flame that I didn't need. I literally went to him because I needed somebody to just kind of like, okay, yeah, it's all right. It's gonna be fine. It's hard. I get it. And the other thing I will say too is having the generosity, I'll call it generosity of spirit, to hear someone that doesn't agree with you still be open to hearing something compassionate, like the expectation of good when you know that there's disagreement. What I mean, I said a lot of words. What are you getting from what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
I think he must be an extraordinary person
Extremely.
to take the courage of his goddaughter, his adopted goddaughter, and to hear your concerns and not judge you for your opinions, but to say, I care about you. You asked an interesting question. Is there any hope, or what are you, where do you see hope or change? And I think that if more people could approach one another, whether, on opposite sides of an issue or
Yeah.
of the fence, with compassion and say, we disagree on this. However, there's always a however.
Yeah.
I really care about you, and I care deeply about the fact that you're feeling troubled about what you're seeing or what you're hearing or what you're experiencing at the moment. I'm feeling uncertain, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling sad about what I'm
Confused
feeling.
or yeah.
Confused around this. And I think the fact that he took the time to put aside the issues and see you, Valerie, the human, the beautiful human that you are, who is full of compassion, full of empathy, who walks her talk and is genuinely feeling the sense of confusion at the moment, and saying, I'm coming to you rather than going to where I'm going to get validated for my point of view. I'm coming to you because I want to understand more. And I think that if more politicians and more leaders spend more time actually going to people from different sides and saying, what is it that you need? Maybe it's not the rhetoric. Maybe it's, I need more money. I need a better school for my child. I need money for gas so that I can get my child to school every morning because there's no school bus. Or I need more medical help and I can't afford the deductibles, or whatever it might be. I think if people were more willing to say, we might be on different sides on this issue, but what is it that I, as one individual, could ask you or do for you that would make your life easier? Because people aren't their politics. They have lives, they have love, they love and loss and
Yes.
hopes and dreams and struggles.
Yes.
And maybe things are going well and maybe things aren't going so well. And finding out, spending time actually asking those questions about who are you and what makes you you and what is bringing you joy at the moment. Well, you know, I've got these 3 amazing grandchildren that give me hope for the future. They are going to be spirited individuals with very different paths. Or what gives me hope is I've just been traveling and seeing people in different places that have different challenges and will tell you that, oh, this is so bad and this is so bad. But then you look and you think, but they're actually like smiling. They're not feeling, you know, they're getting some joy. They're finding joy. You know, coming back to your original podcast, and finding hope. And I think that's beholden on all of us who are maybe middle class and have a little bit more, to maybe ask questions of other people that maybe don't have as much as we have or are struggling more, and finding out where are those pain points and then trying to see what we can do to change it. If one talks from the lofty hills, I don't think we're going to hear people. And I think that people are feeling very unheard. And because of the splits in the media here is very partisan.
Yeah.
Whereas in other countries, you get maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 channels, and then you get your satellite channels where you can then go and find your news medium of choice.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe it makes it easier, because I think it's easier to be very fractured and to take and to fracture the world. And at the moment, it feels a little bit fractured.
You know, what you're talking about reminds me of of sports. There's a book. It's on my reading list, but I've been hearing a few podcasts that refer to it. The idea of finite and infinite games. You heard about James Carse is the author of the original book of Finite and Infinite Games, and then Simon Sinek has a take on that same book. And so he wrote, I think, his version of Finite and Infinite Games. And the idea is that a finite game, if we were talking about it in terms of sports, right? Let's say a finite game is one that has rules, it has a way to win or a way to lose. So if we take basketball, here's how the game is played, here are the roles, here are how you keep score. And then at the end of the set amount of time, the winner has had this many points, etc. But that's a finite game. The infinite game is sports, right? Or just the idea of athleticism or athletes that doesn't have any specific structure of points. There are no winners and losers per se when you talk about sports as a whole and the idea of being an athlete, right? And so I think what you're pointing to in this idea of having this fractured, these fractured ways of thinking and expressing ourselves, we have made life into a finite. We break it up into all these finite pieces, and so there's like a winner and a loser, right? This is the politics of the day have pit us against each other because somebody has to win, and we have, I think, I'm talking real general terms, especially here in the US, that so much of the news media has been treating this like like a match, right? There's a match that's happening right now, and this one is up, this one is down. Oh, look at this, look the tactic this one used. Oh no, whoa, oh my gosh, this one is coming back with this. And it's become this very dramatic, very interesting and compelling because, you know, sports has a multi-billion-dollar industry all over the world. There's so many people who watch sports, who cheer for their favorite team, and become somehow sometimes the most irrational beings when we have our favorite players on the court. Um, but if we were to zoom out instead and like approach what you just said, which I think is about thinking of, you know, the news media does not dictate the level of stress I have in my day-to-day life, right? If I have enough food in my refrigerator, if the kids are healthy and they have activities over the summer, if I'm not worried about carpool, if I'm not worried about the weather is raining so much or so little, right? All of those day-to-day things that impact my life, the news media does not dictate what happens in my life. But I think we have allowed that the news to somehow infiltrate so much of our well-being is kind of hanging on to that. So one, the news does not dictate my stress. I've already decided that. I'm very selective and very intentional about what I watch, when I watch it, and how much of it I consume. Social media, same. Um, I focus less on winning a particular point of view and more on teaming, right? So who's playing and what do they want? What does that look like? How long have you been playing this game? Right? I remember starting to ask the question, and I don't know if I've asked you. I know I like to ask you weird questions. Maybe I should ask you this question. Um, okay, I'm gonna ask you because you're always so open. Okay, and I know we're almost at time here. So would you consider yourself more liberal leaning or more conservative leaning?
Liberal.
Liberal. When did you decide that?
I grew up like that.
Okay, and what moment in time would you say you were aware that when you say you grew up like that, let me just first of all follow up. You grew up like that meaning what, your family, your parents, your school, what does that mean?
Definitely my family. I grew up in South Africa, and I grew up in the heart of apartheid during the really dark years of apartheid. And people will say they didn't know what was going on. But I lived in a family that was very aware of what was going on, that were trying to do their good to help people.
Mhm.
I had a mother who belonged and ran an organization that did what they called a feeding scheme, which took big sacks of maize meal, cornmeal,
Mhm.
you'd say in this country, in the back of her little Morris Minor, I think it was. We'd sit on top of it and go with a friend and drive for 2 hours to this place called a location, which is a terrible word, which is that deeply rural area where people were starving, that had no rain, that had nothing. Should take these things from her organization, big cartons of powdered milk and this cornmeal.
Mm.
And there I saw these little kids, most beautiful faces, happy to see us with these big, and I was probably like 7, 8, 9, these big extended stomachs with kwashiorkor, with
Malnutrition.
malnutrition. And that's when I started learning
Mm.
about how most people, or a lot of people, were living in South Africa or were struggling. And you
Right.
see people, and that's, I think, was the beginning of my education, or my
Mhm. It's the exposure.
exposure of wanting to care for the world, or wanting to make a difference, or wanting to help repair the world in whatever small way
Yeah.
I can contribute.
Mm. First of all, thank you for sharing that. I wish, I think that's something I'm learning too. If we can get to the asking people that question, like, when did you decide that this was the point of view that you wanted to adopt? Not from a way of challenging or trying to educate them, why is that, why it's wrong and historically inaccurate or whatever, but really from understanding like what is it that connected or resonated for you there, right? I think about my own upbringing. So much of my ideas and perspectives came from what my parents said around the table and what then, the empirical evidence I gathered as I lived and traveled and all of those things. And I remember having some really challenging conversations with people like even my own family. My brothers are much more conservative in their spiritual and religious views. I've developed other, ideas about spirituality. And when they challenged me and I said, well, we all grew up in the same household. We all grew up learning the same things. At what point did you decide that this was your way? I'll tell you when one, even in our same household, we all grew up into the same church. We grew up, the same, we heard the same music, all of that until a certain point, and then we started to differentiate. And that's the point, I think, that if we could get to ask a question, wanting to understand, like going back to the very beginning, understanding someone else is like, when did you decide or when did you discover that something else resonated for you? And when I've shared that with my brothers and I say, hey, we all grew up this way, but then I started to see this and I saw that and I experienced this. And then I decided that. And since then, I've changed my mind 8 times, but here where I am today. Um, and I hear their perspective, it all of a sudden nullifies a lot of the conflict and the friction of us trying to convince one view is better than the other. I'm like, we have changed our minds since we were 10 years old or 12 or whatever. So, what is that to say about me now being 52 and I can change my mind again? So, oh my gosh, Ingrid, you got me all riled up now.
Oh, I'd love to continue this conversation and hearing more about your point of view and about that divergence and how you deal with the tension when it comes up in your family.
Oof. I just say we ask questions, asking questions and not so one of my brothers they're twins by the way. One of them happens to be much more, I don't know, uh, guarded, I would say maybe is a better word about this is what I think, here's how I feel, this is what I've discovered. And he's changed his mind over the years. I've seen it and I've even pointed out all of those things. But for him, is a life is safety. And there's a sense of I have a life that I love right now because of my beliefs. And adopting those beliefs have helped me survive all the things that I've had to deal with. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, who would I want to take that away from someone? No. Why would I need to convince you otherwise? Don't think that way. Like, no, please. If this helps you survive, continue. It doesn't, it doesn't impact me at all. If nothing else, I understand them more. So I think I've had to also check myself. Like, what am I trying to accomplish? Am I seeking to understand this person, or am I seeking to educate, or am I seeking to, feel superior? And I think if we could just understand our own intentions, that sometimes helps. And even I think, Ingrid, if we want to be really courageous, we tell people our intention, you know? I'm kind of trying to educate you right now because I want to be right. Or I want to prove all the ways in which I disagree with you and you're wrong. Even saying that out loud sounds so preposterous that I think it helps us kind of realize, oh, okay, I'm kind of an ego trip right now. I think my intention with you in this conversation has been to connect and to discover and explore. And we didn't get as spicy as I would have liked to. And I think it took us a little bit longer to get into the spice. I wasn't quite sure how much spice we would have in our conversation. I'm glad we touched a little bit on it.
Well, I'm sorry you didn't ask the spicy questions earlier on.
I know, right? I was being too tentative. Darn. But I do have one. Do you have a couple more minutes, by the way?
Oh, a
Yeah,
pleasure.
okay. I do have one quick thing I wanted to mention. I saw on Instagram a few months ago something that was really impactful to me, and it was about all the ways in which we support social change, and that there is no one way to do it. So even as we're talking about this, what's a spicy conversation and what isn't, and what's helpful and what's supportive, and all of those things. This particular perspective had 12 different ways in which somebody could be, and I'll attach that. I'll make sure I put that in the notes. But I ended up buying this person's book. Her name is Deepa Iyer, or Iyer, Deepa
Okay.
Iyer. Yep.
Yeah.
And the book is called Social Change Now: A Guide for Reflection and Connection.
Oh,
And
sounds
what's
really interesting.
fast, yeah, it's so fascinating. And so she put together this map of 12 different ways, and I don't know if you can really see any of these. I'll read them to you. 12 different ways that we can support people. And so you and I are of the flavor, ask questions, get to know them, understand, be empathetic, compassionate, right? Um, but here there are other options. There are people who are healers who help people deal with the trauma and support and heal that. There are people who are storytellers who help kind of bridge here, give context to what's happening, or tell everyone else the stories that help people understand the causes even more profoundly. There are people who are disruptors who might go out there and march and protest. There are the frontline responders who are there to take care of, make sure that there's structure and people are getting fed. Or, I think about Jose Andres, who put together the World Kitchen.
It's
He's a
amazing.
frontline responder person, visionaries who can speak and cast visions about what the world could look like or what this movement could accomplish. Caregivers, I think you and I might fall into the space of like caregivers and maybe guides or healers, where we're there to listen and to support and hold space to identify what's needed and provide, the empathy that's needed, or the support, or connect people, to those individuals. So it was really validating, I guess the word is for me right now, that dealing with, managing, helping there's not one right way to do it, right? There's multiple ways in which we can be of service, and our job is to get in alignment with that way of serving. And if I know that you do not have the bandwidth or the curiosity to ask questions of the people around you, or your team or whatever. That's why we get hired, Ingrid. Really, the reason we get hired to be coaches is because there are a lot of leaders who are like, that's not my thing. I don't have the time. I have too many other things on my plate. Let's hire a group of people who can come in and handle this for us, or give us the insights that are needed so that we can put in the systems and processes to help. Right? So, yeah, there's that. I've said a lot of things, but thoughts?
I love it, and I'd love to know more. And what one spicy question didn't you ask me?
What one spicy question? Okay. So, when you disagree I recall, I'll be real spicy. I recall you and I were actually on a Zoom, just having one of our little monthly check-ins, when the Capitol, in the US Capitol, right, was stormed by a group of people, and you stopped. Like, we couldn't even finish the conversation, and you were saying, hey, CNN is showing this or whatever, right? You shared all that. When you have a strong reaction to something that's happening in the world, and you are seeing it with your own eyes, or you're hearing it with your own ears, how do you pause, or get present enough to either provide support or gain understanding? Like, when there's something that gets you so, engaged. I don't want to say triggered. It's not necessarily a bad or good thing, but it's when you find yourself like really sucked into something, you're really engaged, you have a strong opinion. What do you do to temper it enough to have some of the conversations that we've been talking about?
That is a really brilliant question. I try and read up and listen to the
Mm.
news as much as I can, listen to podcasts and
Okay.
hear other people's, and find people that I can share a conversation with.
Hmm.
Because if I can't speak about it, I feel like it gets pent up. I feel I have all this knowledge and all this
Mm.
information that I've been gathering from not necessarily multiple sides, but I try and hear other people's points of view, try and watch the opposition, not the opposition, try and watch other media and find out what other people are thinking
Yeah.
briefly. Not very often, not often enough, but I find having people to talk to about it
Yeah.
and to share what my instincts are. Maybe it's not what I'm reading and not what I'm hearing, but something that I'm seeing or believing or challenging somebody else's point of view. But having some space to have this conversation with
Mm.
people, I find that really both exhilarating and yeah, exhilarating. And having that intellectual sparring about it for me
Mm.
is really interesting. So maybe I should have phoned you back the next day to talk to you about what you were seeing and hearing and thinking and feeling about it, and then have some sort of conversation. And that's something I miss actually about South Africa. There's a lot of, you have a dinner party and there's always interesting
Mm.
conversations.
Mm.
Here I find people um, don't, maybe I'm not mixing in the right circles, but I don't find,
Yeah.
sometimes I have some friends that I've been able to have these conversations with, but unfortunately they're all somewhere else now. They're not here in the
Mm.
area anymore. But I like having a space to both unpack and look at other points of view and hear other people's opinions and hear their wisdom and maybe challenge the status quo.
Yeah. So it sounds like for you, one of the first things you do, and you've mentioned this a few times in other contexts, is gather knowledge, right? Just to educate yourself, to be as aware of all the points of view or what's happening in that situation, and then to socialize your learning with others, right? To get into conversation, intellectual banter, debate, right, with other people. So interestingly, I think I did that with you before we started talking about this podcast because as everything that was unfolding in the Middle East, I was sharing with you that I've been hearing so many different points of views from people who I'm close to. And I just needed a trusted source that I could go in and call and say, all right, I need you to give me some context, not even context. I don't know what I asked for specifically, but I do you remember what I asked you or what did I ask for?
You're feeling caught between
Yeah.
different points of view. You're hearing certain points of view about, I mean, I won't mention what was, but you're hearing certain points of view from one part of your family and another point of view from other people. And
Yeah.
we're trying to make sense of
Mm.
where you stood, or where
Yes.
not. I think you knew where you stood, but finding how do you navigate that? And that
Yeah.
was a discussion we had that I found really actually exhilarating and fascinating, and was very honored that you thought you could ask me.
Yeah. Well, I think that's okay. I want to go back a little bit. So you said after everything that happened on January 6th and that you were so captivated by that you should have followed up with me to discuss it. I actually think you made the best choice not to, right? Because I didn't have the strong reaction that you did. I didn't have that and I wasn't as engaged as you were. And for you to have that intellectual stimulation, it's probably best to have had it with other groups of people. Because where I see myself, and one of the reasons I reached out to you is I want to understand everybody. I want to, you've already heard it through all of our conversation today. And I want to get to a point where I can see the human behind the concern, right? To understand, like, okay, how do I help this individual, feel better or feel safe or feel whatever point of view they have about something, whether I agree or not. And I think where what I needed most is because I didn't have a strong opinion. I don't have a favorite team. I don't have a favorite team. There's not a team that I want to win or a team that I want to lose. And that's often me. I'm not a competitive person at all. I love playing tennis when it's fun and we're playing and I'm getting better at the skill of tennis, like the game. But whether I win or lose, I don't really care that much. I just want to play well. And I think in those moments, I was finding that I don't want to choose a winner or a loser. I want to play well. I want to learn how to play so that we can be teaming. How can I be a better teammate? And I think that's where I was struggling. And I think, and for you specifically, because you can hear that, you're not trying to sway me to think this way or that way. And you hear me just like my godfather. You can hear what I need as a human being. I felt very safe. And because you are able to, you have some insight into the situation, I can go, okay, Ingrid, how can I be a better teammate here? I want to be able to honor anybody's preferences and sides, right? And that was really helpful. And I think out of that, you also gave me the courage to really bring these types of topics to the podcast because somebody is caught in the middle somewhere too, and oh, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to hurt people's feelings. Or I don't want to trigger an argument. I'm actually no, find the right person to talk to. I think that's like the lesson in everything today. Find the right person to talk to. I found you, Ingrid.
Well, I'm very grateful you found me, and I'm very happy to have these conversations. And I'm not a team player either. I'm not a team sport person.
Mhm.
I'm not very sporty at all. However, I think that was the news junkie in me that was just like really fired up by what I was seeing and hearing, and the feeling of disbelief, I
Yeah.
suppose. And it happened in Brazil a few months later. And I feel, and it, for me, I think I wish I had reached out to you because I think it would have been a very interesting conversation because I would have learned something new. And I would have learned something that maybe I wasn't seeing because I feel that my skill is there's a wonderful expression in South Africa called picking up stompies. Stompies are the ends of cigarettes. So people would pick up the end of cigarettes and take that last little drop of tobacco and create a new rolling because people were and still many are very poor.
Huh.
That is in conversation, picking up stompies is picking up different
Mm.
bits of information from different places and then threading it together to a narrative for myself. And I think
Mm.
that I'm very good at that. And that's why I think that I like being in South Africa because you do have conversations with people about different sides of issues or trying to find out more, dig deeper to understand what's both not being said or
Yeah.
what could enlighten me. I
Mm.
feel like you can put me down anywhere in the world. And that was the thing I meant to mention about India. Is that you can put me down anywhere in the world, even if I don't speak the language. I can, through a smile or a gesture, or find some way of some commonality. And I
Hmm.
think that's my mission in life is to find that commonality and help other
Yes.
people find just some little touch point
Yeah.
where people can see each other as humans.
Same. Same. There you go. That's the soul connection that we've been talking about from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it goes back to not every I'm learning now the older I get that not everybody has to be that way for me, right? Not everyone has to provide the same thing. In fact, it's like it's like restaurants. In Dallas, they say that we have we have the highest number of restaurants per capita of any city in the US. That's what's said. And it's true. If I feel like having Pakistani food, which I did last weekend, I can go to a Pakistani restaurant. I the other day felt like having some, some gordita, some Ecuadorian, Salvadorian food. So I went to a Salvadorian restaurant. I can go get Chinese food if I want. Or I can go get Thai food, and I can get, a Southern barbecue. There's so many types. If I were to go to a, a mall and just like a food court, there's tons of types of food there too. And I kind of start thinking and equating to people, right? We all have different, there, all those places cook that food. as best they can. They do the best job at representing that particular culture and that cuisine. I think of people, if I think of all the people in my life as that person is a representation of all these different elements of humanity with different points of view, different experiences, different ideas, different personalities. My job is to like, what kind of conversation am I in the mood for today? And who can I have that conversation with that would fulfill what I need, right? Just like I would pick a cuisine to eat. And so I think part of what I'm kind of validating in this conversation too is that I can't expect every restaurant to fulfill the need for, salty and sweet. That's not right. That's not part of the cuisine, perhaps, right? Or spicy and cold. Maybe that's not part of the cuisine. And the same goes for a human being. I can't expect everybody to always have the intellectual stimulation that I want to have. I can't expect that person to make me laugh and have a fun, enjoyable conversation. I can't expect that person to always be ready to share a tear, or fears, or vulnerable. That's not it. So my job is to be able to identify what do I need right now? What would be the best way to get those needs met? And who in my circle might provide me with that? And I'm grateful that I have the distinction, honor of having so many different types of people. And I can go to like, oh, Ingrid would be perfect for this conversation because, and sure enough, when I come to you, we have a conversation. I'm just like, that's exactly what I needed. And you don't give me answers, you don't lecture me, you don't give me like, we don't debate, do we? I don't think we debate.
So we have a conversation.
Yeah, we have a
And I feel
conversation.
that's much more interesting having a conversation than,
Yes.
debate gets to, you've got to take a side and you've got to
Yeah,
push your point of view to win that debate.
there you go. But there's some people that are really great debaters. I have a niece who just, whoo, give her a topic. She has a strong opinion. She was in the debate club. She did great mock trial. I mean, oh my gosh, she's gifted, so gifted. And that's the person that I want if I need to make a case for myself. If I need an advocate, I need somebody that's 100% confident and has that power of conviction, right? But when you and I have this conversation, I don't come to you because of your power of conviction. I come to you for your power of presence. I come to you for power of intention, right? And communication. So we'll just throw in the 5 powers that we learned at Berkeley. Just cuz.
Thank you, Mark Rittenberg. I
Mark
have
would
to
be so
add that in.
proud.
I have to add that in since he designed them.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ingrid. This has been a really lovely conversation, especially asking me for the spicy question. I think it generated some more thoughts. Any final words or insights you want to share before we begin to sign off?
Just to anyone who listens all the way to this end, be curious. Be curious about the people around you. Be curious about your Uber driver, or the bus driver, or someone sitting next to you in a cinema while you're waiting instead of being on your phone.
Mm.
Strike up a conversation. You might be really surprised at what you learn.
Yes, 100%. Be curious. And if you're not the one to get curious because you don't have the time or the energy or you don't know what questions to come up with, find the most curious person in your circle of friends and hang out with them. Take them to the movies, take them to a restaurant. They will be the ones driving that conversation. I promise. If you ever invite me, just know I'm the one that's going to get to know your person.
Well, I look forward to our next meal together.
Yay, same. I get to do that Valerie thing, as my brothers call it.
Wonderful. I'd love to do the Valerie thing with you.
Awesome. Oh, Ingrid, thank you so much for your generosity of spirit, your listening, your ability to just be with this whole conversation and share so lovely and so graciously all the things that you've learned. Not even all the things, the things that you've learned that have been the most relevant today, I guess. You have so much more than what we ever would have time to discuss in a forum like this. I appreciate your friendship. Thank you for being a part of my circle of hope. You give me hope.
You give me lots of hope, and I really am very honored that you asked me and
Yay.
appreciate it.
Oh, wonderful. Well, for those of you who stayed, like I said, for this hour and a half conversation, I know, right? Thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time and attention. And I'm so grateful that this conversation, if hopefully has spurred you to think about your own circle and who in your life would be the most appropriate person to process some of these conversations or process some of these experiences that you have. So stay tuned. I can't wait for the next episodes. So make sure that you're subscribed and can't wait for the next time. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Circle of Hope. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and share with someone in your circle. And if you're curious about the upcoming book, visit valeriehope.com for updates and extras. Until then, stay connected.